Hello and welcome to my presentation this afternoon. My name is Xenia Pestova Bennett and I'm going to talk to you about Karlheinz Essl's version of Bach's Goldberg Variations, Gold.Berg.Werk. So before we launch into the presentation, I'm just going to give you an outline, so hopefully you can see my shared screen here. And I know some people like to get an idea of what's coming. So I'm going to introduce myself and my interest in the topic. I'm going to talk to you from the performance perspective. I am a performer. We'll discuss the compositional background of this piece, look at technological considerations, combining piano and live electronics. I will talk about some performance practice considerations, and following on from a brief conclusion, we'll have some time to share our impressions, discuss, and ask questions in real time. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, so hopefully you can see me. Hello, very, very nice to be speaking to you today. So my background, I am a classically trained pianist. And at the same time, of course, I love so-called traditional repertoire, which is something I'm very much grounded in. But I'm very interested in what I call living music. Of course, all music is arguably living music, but also music that is created and recreated today, music written by living composers. I'm also very interested in improvisation and composition. I'm a composer myself, as well as a pianist. So, living and working today as an interpreter is, of course, very interesting. We have so many changes, so many developments, so much to take on and reflect on. And I feel it is important to think, as performers, how can we present music in contexts that are also relevant to today's audiences? So do we just continue creating work in the same way, or can we search for new ways? Can we search for new interpretation insights? And of course my preference is for the latter, and this is what I'm going to speak to you about today. So today's topic is Goldberg.Werk, a piece written by Austrian composer Karlheinz Essl between 2013 and 2016. And Karlheinz Essl is also a performer and improviser. So he's a double bassist, he's a multimedia artist, and also a teacher. So he comes from different backgrounds, different traditions, and also brings these different strands together in his work as a composer. His background is also quite interesting in that he was very much into sciences, and as a child studied chemistry. So he talks about the influence of this on his work and his interest in the synthesis and analysis of substances. So let us speak now about the piece. So the inspiration for Karlheinz Essl's Goldberg.Werk. And of course this is a cornerstone of keyboard repertoire that we're all familiar with, the Goldberg Variations by J.S. Bach. The subtitle of this set of variations, as translated from the German, reads something like keyboard practice, keyboard exercises, consisting of an aria with diverse variations for harpsichord with 2 manuals. And this is, of course, very important. We'll come back to this point, harpsichord with 2 manuals. Composed for the soul's delight of music lovers by Johann Sebastian Bach. So this is also something quite important, soul's delight of music lovers. And according to scholar Peter Williams, this pious connotation is not trivial at all. Williams says, spirits are refreshed or recreated not merely for idle pleasure, but to prepare us for further work with the talents that have been entrusted to us, and this for the sake of our neighbor. So we can perhaps think about this as not intended as a showy, virtuosic performance, but rather a humble, pious, spiritual offering, if we think about this piece from Bach's point of view. So this was a work published in 1741, and according to legend, which again might be familiar, this was composed for a student, a pupil of Bach, Johann Gottlieb Goldberg, who was employed as a musician in the service of Count Kaiserlink during sleepless nights. Apparently, he would be requested to play for the Count to help him fall asleep. However, of course, we don't know whether this is true or not. There is no record of any dedication to the Count that was documented. And there is also the question of the period of composition, which was likely between 1739 and 1740, and the age of the young Goldberg at the time, who was born in 1727. So he would have been very young indeed. So we just don't know how true this story is. Karlheinz Essl was approached by the Orpheus trio to create a version of the Goldberg Variations for string trio. And the title Gold.Berg.Werk can be interpreted as gold mine work, if we translate from German. So there is also a reference for taking an existing work and mining for treasure. The process of composition of this original version for string trio and live electronics is very well documented on the composer's website, and you will have had a link to read this documentation for those of you who are students who are joining the talk. So the composer writes, in Gold.Berg.Werk, J.S. Bach's Goldberg Variations are confronted with electronic sounds. I like that term, confronted. They are played between groups of variations, bridging the gap between the sound world of the Baroque era and the sonic reality of the third millennium. The electronics are based on the harmonic progression of the fundamental aria, which I stripped from all figurations and ornamentation. So Essl points out in his analysis that the cycle of variations is based on a 32-bar aria. And the harmonic model, which is a type of expanded chaconne bass, is running through all the variations that follow. We know that the aria has a fully symmetrical structure. So there are 32 bars that are divided equally into two halves of 16 bars, further divided each into groups of 8 bars, and again 2 groups of 4, and down to 2 groups of 2, and then into single bars. So according to Essl, there is a connection here. These are binary divisions, and it's comparable to what we can find in digital systems. We can also find this 32, number 32, the 32-bar structure of the aria in the structure of the whole cycle. So this is also a very interesting connection. We know that the cycle consists of 30 variations with the aria at the beginning and then the aria again at the end. So 32 sections, 32 parts. And the structure works on large scale and small scale, coming from a single idea. And again, Essl points out that this is akin to fractal self-similarity. Very interesting. The composer further divides the original variations by J.S. Bach into 3 types. So there are the character variations, the canons, number 2, and number 3 is harpsichord variations. So character variations are different types of forms, including what he describes as an Italian trio sonata, a passipier, Fuguetta, a jig, French overture, variation 16, which is the kind of restart, halfway point, second half, musette, 4-part motet, and 2 sarabands. Then we have the canons, and every third variation is a strict canon, starting at the unison and then increasing the intervallic structure, all the way to variation 27, which is a canon at the 9th. There is a 10th canon. We expect a canon at the 10th, which is variation 30. But here, Bach instead combines material from popular songs of the day. And apparently it was also practice in Bach's household to compose canons singing together using materials from popular songs. The texts are quite interesting. For example, one of the translation of the texts would be, "I have been away so long, cabbage and beets have driven me away." But anyway, this is in parentheses. And then the harpsichord variations are more virtuoso kind of showpieces that explore the technical possibilities of the two manual harpsichords. So as I said, this is really important because these present particular challenges when we play them on a single keyboard, the single manual. Of course, they're designed for hand crossings on two manuals with one hand easily passing over the other, and we cannot really do that on the piano. So we have to come up with some clever alternatives. So I'm going to show you a slide with the form of this piece. I will show you the form of the original string trio version, and you can see it here. So we have different divisions of character variations and canons, and these are interspersed with electronic interludes. And then for the piano or harpsichord version, we have a different configuration, which we can see here. So the original variations are interspersed differently. And again, we have the electronic interludes, and these are the same as in the string trio version. There is also a version for saxophone quartet, but we will not be discussing this version today. So the electronic interludes are generated in real time, and this is assuming the composer can attend the performance. So the composer is also a performer seated on stage with the pianist, in the case of the piano version, and performing together as a duo, really. However, if the composer is not able to attend, there is also a fixed media version, a predetermined, pre-generated version of the electronics that can then still be performed in real time by another person. And this is where also spatialization comes into play, and we'll talk about the spatial aspect in a moment. So the composer writes about the electronics. A recording of the reduced aria played by a string trio was used in a series of sound experiments. With the help of a computer program written in Max MSP, I started to improvise with this recorded material. This provided new and surprising approaches to a music that was so familiar to me. It seemed as though I was traveling with a microscope into the interior world of sounds in order to view them in various scales and perspectives. Through the use of granular synthesis, I abolished the goal-directed lapse of time in this music by compressing, stretching, and stopping it ad libitum. Through this, the harmonic progression of Bach's aria is released from its temporal corset. In addition, its harmonic structure becomes modifiable through manipulation of the overtone spectrum. These alterations are carried out in real time with the help of composition algorithms that were specially developed for the purpose in order to create a wealth of different variants. And this continues Bach's own concept of variation and transfers it to the realm of sound. So this is Karlheinz Essl writing in 2012. Coming back to the idea of spatialization in this piece, the placement of the loudspeakers is extremely important, and in fact it is vital to the realization of this version. This is what creates a sense of movement in space and a kind of another dimension, a sense of grandeur through the electronic distribution of the interludes. The piece requires one active loudspeaker, which has a built-in amplifier, to be placed at a distance from the piano behind the audience, and ideally higher up than the level of the performer. So we have a distant loudspeaker, which Karlheinz Essl refers to as the lontano speaker, the faraway speaker. And in addition to this, we have a portable loudspeaker which is placed gently inside the piano. So this is a special transducer loudspeaker, Ampere KX1 Bluetooth speaker. It requires a resonating surface in order to sound, so it has to have contact with the instrument. And placement varies depending on the model of the piano. So very portable as a setup. It means the performer brings this portable transducer loudspeaker, and then as long as you have a venue, obviously with a grand piano, and then with just one other speaker, then you can create this piece. So another important point is that the pianist holds down the pedal during the electronic interludes to add resonance to the sound emanating from the little transducer speaker. And this really creates the kind of sensation that sound is emanating from the piano and is then enhanced, increased, and picked up by the distant lontano loudspeaker. So I'm going to show you a photo of the setup so that you can get an idea of what this little speaker looks like. So you can see here is an image from the performance perspective. We have the little loudspeaker sitting in one of the kind of sound hole rings on the soundboard, and you can see the composer also on stage with the pianist performing together. So, although the electronic interludes and the piano material, which is the original J.S. Bach variations, do not sound simultaneously, there is overlap, and we'll talk about this in more detail shortly. So tuning is very important, and one issue that we encountered, of course, is that the electronic interludes have to be tuned to the instrument in question. For example, we know that some pianos are tuned to 440, whereas Hamburg Steinways are tuned to 443 in Austria. So hence, Karlheinz Essl's electronics were sharp for the instruments that we used in some of the UK concerts and had to subsequently be adjusted. So let's have a look at a short video demonstrating this setup. So I would like to now continue by talking about the performance perspective in this piece. And when approaching a work of the magnitude of Bach's Goldberg Variations, of course, one is immediately struck by the weight of tradition as a performer and all the wonderful interpretations that came before. This can be almost unbearable, an insurmountable task. So it was very refreshing for me to discover this version in a sense, which felt really refreshing in terms of rather than presenting something that has been done so many times, really, and you can sort of think it's a museum artifact. It kind of helped me think about this piece again in terms of a living, breathing, and continuously evolving organism. So I think Bach would have also been open to exploring new technology if this kind of technology was available. My approach in terms of interpreting the work was to do the best I could to remain as authentic and true to the material as possible, given that this is of course already a transcription for the modern grand piano. I learned the complete work to ensure that I was grounded in the context, even though Essl takes out some of the variations and replaces them with electronic interludes. Generally, I tried to stay true as much as possible to the best of my knowledge and experience to Baroque performance practice and ornamentation considerations. I consulted as much research on the subject as I could find. I consulted different editions, and of course I consulted recorded interpretations by others of the original Goldberg Variations, including versions for piano, harpsichord, and even accordion. So, however, I felt it was also important to allow myself some freedom of pianistic interpretation and gestural, idiomatic and ergonomic considerations. And of course, again, considering we're dealing with a different instrument, with the modern grand piano, and also dealing with a single keyboard rather than two keyboards. So there is a subtle nod in my interpretation to the Busoni transcription in the penultimate variation, where I use doubled octaves instead of single notes and treat these as register changes or stops on an organ or harpsichord to create more resonance. And my thinking here, my justification again, is why not exploit what our instruments are capable of today? And again, I think Bach would have approved. Gesture and dialogue between instrumental and electronic sound, or let's say disembodied electronic sound, is also very interesting to consider and can potentially be problematic in repertoire that combines the two. So this can create a disconnect. However, Essl's Goldberg.Werk, I think, is very successful in bringing together these two sound worlds. It's a sort of a bridging of the two sound worlds. I discuss this concept in an earlier paper that I wrote with Andrew Lewis, The Audible and the Physical, a Gestural Typology for Mixed Electronic Music. So there is this idea that sound and gesture in instrumental music is manifested from the physical actions of the performer, whereas in acousmatic electronic music, human or acoustic causes can still be perceived or inferred by the listener. And this can include real or imagined manifestation of physical action. The types of gestures that we can perceive include initiation gestures, continuation gestures, and termination gestures. And especially this is quite apt in the case of the piano, which, apart from some extended techniques, really sound inevitably decays. And we can then shape its decay, so termination gestures. There is also the possibility to explore the transfer of energy between one source and the other source. And this is what is explored in this piece. While the piano material is, as I said, presented in alternation with the electronic interludes, rather than simultaneously, there is a lot of overlap and passing of resonance from one sonic reality to the other. And this is particularly effective in bridging the divide between the two sound worlds and incorporating the element of sound spatialization that then envelops the audience. This is particularly effective in certain sections. For example, in the beginning we have the piano aria, which then flows into the electronic aria and then directly into variation 1, so there is overlap between all three. Or the end of variation 15 flowing to aria electronica 2, which again matches the high D in the piano that starts to decay as the electronic sound comes in, again from the same sound source from the inside of the piano, and kind of morphs and manipulates this piano sound and creates a magical illusion that it does not in fact decay but grows and turns into string sound. So a really interesting magical effect here. One unexpected difficulty that was encountered in terms of performance practice was the periods of prolonged stillness during the electronic interludes. I always tell my students that we are performing whenever we are on stage, regardless of whether we are playing or not. And of course, additionally, the foot of the performer in this piece remains on the pedal to create that resonance for the electronics. So this means that one doesn't really ever relax completely, physically or mentally, even when one is not playing, but listening to the electronic interludes. So this is arguably similar to, but different from, being in an orchestra or ensemble and counting rests. You're still a soloist on stage, and this is also more difficult than performing the whole of the Goldberg Variations through, arguably, because you remain more focused and concentrated if you are continuously playing. You're also able to keep your hands warm, even though it would require potentially more stamina. So this aspect was particularly challenging, performing the work during the colder winter months. For example, after playing the opening aria, the performer sits for about 5 minutes while the electronic aria comes in. And then the performer has to launch into the first variation, which is arguably one of the most difficult because it is quite a rapid tempo and has to be very confident and has some leaps, has some very clear articulations, has to be really, really precise. And this is really difficult with cold hands. Your hands, of course, potentially get cold as you sit very, very still for 5 minutes. So I haven't really found a solution for this. Maybe having a hot water bottle, but then how can you be very subtle with that? So maybe you have some suggestions for me. Also, the foot can potentially start trembling on the pedal from tension if one is not consciously able to relax. So I'm going to conclude very briefly by asking a question. How can we take forward our mode of presentation of whatever music we choose to perform, whether it is more traditional existing repertoire or maybe new repertoire? How can we enhance the audience experience and enhance our own understanding of the music? And I think this question and these kinds of questions are very valid and important today. We really need to be brave in how we present music, and we have to make it relevant for audiences, for contemporary audiences living today and for contemporary contexts. And this is especially important at the moment because we really now have to recontextualize and reconsider potentially the modes of presentation of music and find ways to keep music and performed music alive. So really we have to remember why we're doing this and why it's important. It's so important for so many reasons. But how do we find imaginative ways to work, to present, to share music with people? So we have just recorded this piece, and very hopefully there will be a commercially released recording in the coming months, so please keep an eye out. I'm not able to share any more details at the moment, but I very much hope that I'll be able to share that recording with you in the future. So thank you very much. We will now move on to questions and discussion.